Hey everyone, welcome to Great Lakes Church. My name is Carson, and I gotta tell you before we get into our weekly message that we're a community of people helping people find and follow Jesus. We're based out of Southeast Wisconsin. We have physical locations in Kenosha and Racine, but if you're listening to this or watching this, you've found our online presence. We share content on our YouTube and our podcast platforms wherever you listen, and we love that you're a part. If you want to know more about what's going on here at Great Lakes Church, you can find out more at greatlakeschurch.com or check out our central hub. But until then, everything you need is going to be in the description, so enjoy the message, and we'll catch you next time.
Well, today we are kicking off a 3-week teaching series called Don't Forget to Remember. And so after being the pastor of this church for 15 years, having started this church, right, there are a few things that I want to make sure you don't forget to remember. And that's what this series, just 3 weeks, is going to be focusing on. Now, the past 2 Sundays, I have been gone. And the reason why is I went to Seattle knowing that I have to find a rental house, knowing that I have to find a school for my son to enroll in, and my wife was with me. It was just a very busy time in Seattle. But when we flew in a week and a half ago, we needed to pick up a rental car. And so my wife and I ended up getting a Chevy Malibu. It's a nice car. Haven't driven a Malibu for a long time, and so it was great. We take off and head about 30 minutes away, and while we're driving, we sensed that someone had smoked cigarettes in this car right before us, right? Now it's like, I wonder if Pastor Josh was in this car before, but I smell this stuff, and not only does it smell like cigarettes, it smells like chemical, like that, you know, to clean it up, and it smells like maybe some air freshener. Just something wasn't right. But I'm telling you, I promise you, I'm not petty like this. I was like, I'm not gonna be in this car for 10 days. And my wife, she was like, me neither, and she had the window rolled down, and my eyes were starting to water. That's how strong these chemicals were. So I called the car rental place, and I said, listen, I don't want to do this. I feel stupid. I've never done this in all my years of renting, but I want to return this car. They said, not a problem, but here's the deal. You actually don't want to return it. You want to exchange it. They said, this is important because otherwise it's just going to end up being a lot of paperwork. So I drive all the way back to SeaTac Airport. I go to the car rental returns because that's where they told me to go. And then I got out of the car before they scanned it, before they did any paperwork. I says, oh, stop. This is not a return. I know I'm in returns. This is not a return. This is an exchange. They said, oh, okay. I said, you've done exchange before, right? Oh, yeah, we do them all the time. I said, great. Not a return. This is an exchange. They said, okay. Well, they returned it. And I don't even know what happened because I went to get the exchange. They said, oh, it looks like it's been returned. You were charged for the day. Now you have to fill out paperwork. So I ended up waiting for about 45 minutes. Not just in line, but then, you know, filling out the paperwork, whatever. And at that point, they ended up giving me an electric vehicle, a Subaru Solterra. All right? Now, I felt like I was king of the castle. I've never driven an all-electric vehicle. And so super excited. It's like, okay, maybe it was worth the trade here. As I'm leaving, the attendant says, hey, I noticed that there's 0 charge in your vehicle. I said, well, I mean, it's running. They said, yeah, it might run for a little bit, but I promise you get on the interstate, that thing's dying. I said, okay, where do I go to charge this up? They said, well, it's not the way it works. You've got to exchange this. I said, okay. Sure enough, I exchanged it. I kid you not, at that car rental place, between returns and check-in, like there's 2 different places to go, I just kept going back and forth, trying to make sense of all this. They finally gave me another Subaru. And they just say, you know, take it, get out of here. So this one was like 80-some%. I was happy. And what happened at that point, we got a Tesla here. But what ended up happening is as I'm leaving with my Solterra, they said, hey, make sure you have the charger cord. And sure enough, it did not have the charger cord. So they called on the walkie-talkie and said, hey, we need a charger cord. They said, that's not the way it works. We don't just take one out of another vehicle. So they had me exchange it again. I waited in line for 1 hour before I got the Tesla. And they just kind of gave me this free upgrade. And I would say, well, I think it was worth it. But here's the deal. From the time this process started until it ended was 5 hours. And I want you to know, some of you have been around for a while, you know my intensity. I never lost my cool. I did not swear at anybody, and I was respectful the entire time. Wow. Hold on. And it's not because I wanted to be, it's because I don't know who goes to Timberlake Church. So I was just like, I'm not chancing that at this point, right? But here's the deal. throughout this process, I kept thinking to myself, I know I've never worked at a car rental place, but I guarantee I could do a better job than these people. If I was in charge, right, if I could just have the reins of this, I guarantee I could get some systems and some structure and we can make this thing happen. It's just so naive. It's like, dude, not only have I not worked at a car rental place, I've not worked at one at the airport, which is crazy busy. But I was like, oh, I think I could do that. And I think all of us, to some extent or another, have that attitude inside of us, right? We don't have any kids, and we look at those with kids, and we say, oh, if I was a parent, I'd be way better than them. Come on, right? This is why when we're teenagers, we think we could run the world. We could do a way better job than the adults do. This is why when we start out our career or we're employed and we're kind of new to the job, we're thinking, oh man, I would be a way better boss. I'd be a way better manager if I was in charge. I mean, how many times over the years have you thought, man, I guarantee you, even though I've never been in politics, I could do a better job of leading this country. I could do a better job of leading this organization. I could do a better job of leading this department. Now, thinking that way can obviously be very unhealthy, and it can lead to a lot of arrogance and disrespect. However, there are times where that way of thinking can fuel an individual or a group of individuals to do something different, to try something. They've got some in the back of their heads that say, man, if I was in charge, I've got this thing inside of me that won't go away, and I think I could do it a little bit differently. And 15 years ago, when my wife Randy and I first moved to Southeast Wisconsin and we started meeting with people in the Kenosha and Racine area, we started sharing the vision that was burning in our hearts of Great Lakes Church and the kind of church we wanted it to be. And very candidly, I'm going to say, it was a different kind of church. If we wanted it to be like every other church, we would have just joined the staff of another church. But I had this thinking inside of me, a little bit of this attitude that kept going. If I had the opportunity, I'd love to try to see if we could do things a little bit differently. And it wasn't birthed out of arrogance. It wasn't birthed out of disrespect. It was just this fire that I just couldn't escape. It was like a shut up in my bones, type of fire. And that's why from the beginning, we adopted a phrase for our church that was very simple. It was just church for the rest of us. We didn't want to be a church for a bunch of people who would label themselves as church people. We didn't want to be a church for a bunch of religious people. We wanted to start a church for the 70% of people living in Southeast Wisconsin and Northern Illinois who don't go to church anywhere. We wanted to start a church for people who felt like, for whatever reason, they couldn't relate to or connect with a traditional type of church. Now, in many ways, we did it because we were naive, right? It's like starting a coffee shop for people who don't drink coffee. It doesn't really make sense when you step back and think about it, but this vision was burning so strong inside of us at the time, and it continues to burn. And it's because of something that happened inside of me back when I was in my mid-20s. So to give you a little bit of context, for all of my life, all the way back to preschool, I've been part of a church community. All of my growing up years were at Journey Church in Kenosha. Most of the time, it was not at the building that Journey currently at. It was actually at this building. Pull up that picture. It was actually at that building on 60th Street and Pershing, which is now Kenosha City Church. All right? So growing up at Journey, I got to tell you, I had a ton of positive experiences. That's where I surrendered my life to Jesus. That's where I was water baptized. I made lots and lots of friends. The very first talk that I ever gave was 13 years old. It was to my youth group at Journey Church. So to this day, I have lots of friends from that time period. In fact, several of them helped us start Great Lakes Church. Many, many great memories. And because that was my experience, from the time I was a child all the way really into my early 20s, I just loved the church. I was excited about it. And I got to the point where I knew I wanted to be a pastor. I wanted to spend my life serving the church. But then somewhere in my early to mid-20s, something started to change inside of me, and it wasn't good. I don't blame anybody, right? I don't point fingers at anybody. I don't feel like I'm a victim. And I'm not trying to be funny when I say this, but what changed was I became a pastor. And I joined a church staff. And for the first time in my life, I had this front row seat to the gap that exists between the church and real life. And it frustrated me. And this was a season of my life where I'm attending 3 church services a week, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. I'm involved in a group that meets at a different night of the week. all throughout the year, there's events and special things that the church is doing that I need to be there for. And so I'm spending the bulk of my time either preparing for or attending church gatherings. And the people I was doing it with, man, I loved them. They're great people. They loved Jesus. They were kind. They were compassionate. They wanted other people to become followers of Jesus. The problem was they weren't really doing a great job at it. And that's not being mean. I'm not trying to diss anybody. These people who had a genuine and sincere desire for other people to come to faith, they would go about it by talking a whole lot and focusing on what they were against and who they were against. And probably not surprising, they had very few friends outside of the church. I mean, why would anybody be a friend with someone who's against everything they're doing? Now, admittedly, this might surprise you, the same could be said of me. Reality is I didn't have any friends who weren't followers of Jesus. And I spent a whole lot of my early years as a pastor talking about and spending my efforts, being anti all the things that I was against. Being anti, anything and everything. And I don't know what happened. It just started bothering me. I started to get restless. I started to feel like, man, I don't want to just spend my life against everything. I was just kind of in this bubble. And this frustration with church just started growing and growing and growing. I kept wondering, is this what my life's going to be like? Am I giving my life to this? Attending church services, hiding, my failures, because you can only be so vulnerable. Living in an echo chamber where everybody is always reinforcing my worldview all the time. Well, that frustration eventually becomes a several-year journey in which I start spending a lot of time praying and reflecting and reading about the church. It became an obsession of mine. And in that season, right here I am, mid-20s, I start to think, well, if I had the opportunity to lead, I think I'd do things differently. I think I would try a different approach. I thought it was super unique. And then I started to meet other pastors who thought the same way, and they thought differently. I started to connect with churches who were trying new things, and I was like, man, this is it. This is what I want to do. This is what I want to try. Now, the word church is found 115 times in our Bible. And it's a Greek word because most of the New Testament, which is the second part of our Bible, it was written in Greek. The word church is the word ecclesia, or assembly. It means gathering, or community, or congregation. Right? That's what the word ecclesia means. It's not even a religious word. Which is interesting because it means all of the words that we use to associate with the term church. Buildings, stained glass windows, choirs, sermons, right? They don't really define the church. At its very core, the church of Jesus Christ is a community of people. It's a faith family. It's an assembly of individuals who've been gathered together and united together under the banner of Jesus. And whenever a gathering of people assemble, you know this. There's going to be lots of different personalities and opinions and quirks and preferences. And so when a church comes together, there are lots and lots of differences. But historically, throughout history, whenever people in the church have gathered together and they've chosen to set aside their differences and they've determined to link arms and use their gifts and their personalities and their experiences and their passions to love and serve people, they've gone out and they've changed their community, and in some cases, they've gone on to change the world. And so in my mid-20s, I kind of came to this conclusion. That's what I want to be a part of. That's what I want to give my life to. And it was in this season of my life where I heard a quote for the very first time that I resonated with in a very powerful way. And that quote was, the local church is the hope of the world. The United States of America, not the hope of the world. Our government, not the hope of the world. Trump or Biden, not the hope of the world. Unions, not the hope of the world. Chick-fil-A, not the hope of the world. Giannis, not the hope of the world. But the local church, as it represents Jesus, as it points people to Jesus, is the hope of the world. And Jesus alludes to this in the most famous talk he ever gave. He's surrounded by a large group of people. He's talking on a variety of topics. And then he looks at this crowd, many of them his followers, and he says this to them. He says, "You are the salt of the earth." Now, when Jesus makes this statement, everybody in his audience knows that salt is used as a preservative. Right? It's this time period in history where it's not just for flavoring. That's what we do, right? Let's season the food, let's flavor the food. This is a time period where they don't have refrigeration, and so salt is used to preserve food and prevent decomposition. And so Jesus says to his followers, "You are the preservative of the entire earth." Now, Jesus is speaking to a crowd where the strongest and most powerful always win. It's a crowd with women who have no rights, children who have no rights. Mercy and compassion and generosity, they are not considered virtues. Those are things for the weak. And the only way we could ever imagine a world like that is to visit countries in our planet that still operate by that kind of worldview. And Jesus looks at this diverse crowd of people with all different types of power dynamics and all different types of stereotypes, and he says, "You're salt. I want you to know that you preserve, you make things better as my followers." And then he goes on and he says, "You are the light of the world. Like a city on a hilltop that cannot be hidden." Implication, the world's dark, but you have the potential to bring light to it. He says, no one lights a lamp and then puts it under a basket. Instead, what happens is a lamp is placed on a stand where it gives light to everyone in the house. Jesus says, in the same way, let your good deeds shine out for all to see so that everyone will praise your heavenly Father. And so as Jesus is teaching, his first century audience has to consider this question. Do we want to be a light that attracts people? And if the answer is yes, then Jesus says you need to live your life in such a way that when people see how you treat others, when people see how you do marriage, when people consider the way that you manage your resources, when people notice the way that you accept those with special needs, when people see the way that you foster and adopt kids, they would be blown away by your love. That's how you're light in the midst of darkness. And so the local church is the hope of the world. Now remember, I'm in my mid-20s, and it's starting to really hit me, the power of the local church. But I'm looking at my own life. I'm looking at my inability to connect with anyone who doesn't share my beliefs and my worldview. And I have this growing frustration with the church, and I just don't feel very hopeful at the time. Then to complicate things, I'm in a denomination at the time, which is really a network of churches, and I ended up getting myself in some trouble. Totally my fault, right? Out of anger, I write a letter to a pastor that I used to work for, and I wasn't really nice. I used some slang terms. I made some accusations, which to this day I will tell you they were true, but regardless, the denomination gets involved, and they gave me a checklist. They said, we ought to kick you out of our denomination, but if you follow this checklist and all these things that you're supposed to do, you can stay within the network. Well, it was during this time that I met a guy by the name of Mike Meeks. Years ago, we captured a little bit of the story on film of how I met Mike. I want to show you 2.5 minutes of what happened.
I met Dave through his good friend, James Grogan. And James was working for us in the youth department. He had this buddy named Dave that he wanted us to interview and talk to about showing up here, maybe get a job. He was at that point in Chicago. He had run into some denominational trouble because he didn't like the way another guy got treated by a denominational executive. And he wrote him a nice letter. And
I write out this letter, and it basically goes like this.
Called him a son in the letter.
Less than a week later, I get a certified letter in the mail that charges were being pressed against me.
And so he was called on the carpet for his use of the word, because it turned out that his mother was married when she had him, therefore he couldn't have been the son of. And so we determined that technically he was in error as a result of his use of the term, but was not in error over his indignation over what had occurred with his friend. And so we decided we liked Dave quite a bit, and so what got him in trouble with that group actually got him an interview with us.
3 months later, I get a call from a pastor in San Diego, Mike Meeks, and he says to me, Dave, I want to talk to you about coming on staff here. And I was such a broken individual at that point, truly, truly broken from what had happened. And I said, Mike, this is hard for me to tell you, but I'm just going to level with you. I'm in trouble for my denomination. I'm on probation. Charges have been pressed against me. And he goes, holy cow, what did you do? And I said, well, I wrote a letter and got myself in trouble. He says, do you have the letter? And sure enough, I did. And so he said, would you read it to me? And I was so scared to read it to him because I knew I wanted to go on staff of this church after learning about it. So I just stood there in my kitchen, and I'll never forget this. I'm standing there in my kitchen reading this letter and reading the language, reading everything. And he goes, Dave, I determined a long time ago I'd rather tame a lion than prod a turtle. He goes, you sound like a lion to me. And he goes, I want to give you a chance. He goes, I'd love to have you on our staff. And that day changed my life forever.
All right, so if you can't tell, Mike's a little bit of a maverick, right? He's just a fun guy to be around. My mom had requested that we showed the unedited version, and I said, no, we can't do that, Mom. But here's the deal. Here's the deal. Mike alludes to how I started, but I definitely got pretty colorful in there and pretty intense throughout this letter. And I was a broken person at this moment because I just thought, man, I'm no longer going to be a pastor. I just, went off at this guy. I needed a guy like Mike in my life at that season. I also needed to be a part of a church that was like the church someday I wanted to start. And Mike was the guy who gave me that opportunity. And it was a church that wasn't really interested all that much in making a point. They were interested in making a difference. It was a church that spent disproportional amounts of money and time and energy on serving and loving people rather than just holding services. It was a group of people far from perfect, but they seemed to be comfortable with the mess, but not too comfortable because they were gathering together and they always wanted Jesus to be at work in their lives. It was a place where everybody felt safe inviting their neighbors and their friends and their family. It's one of the fastest growing churches in the country at the time. It was a church that spoke very little about what they were against and a whole lot about what they were for. And so for the first time in my life, I started to have this clear picture of what church could be. And then after being on staff for a few years, I moved to Seattle to be on staff at a very much like-minded church. And that was a great experience for the most part. But eventually, this restlessness started happening inside of me again, and I couldn't escape it. I wanted to start a church like Eastlake in San Diego, somewhere else. And then I started to think, well, Kenosha. But every time I would just step out and make plans, I'd just get so afraid, and I'd stop, and I'd just say, I can't do this. And then finally, in August of 2008, after a series of events, including the death of my brother in Iraq, I took the risk. And Randy and I moved from Seattle to Kenosha, and we started meeting with people, and we started sharing the vision of the kind of church we wanted to start. And very quickly, a group of people came together and said, we're gonna be a part. Let's launch this thing. And in that season, I had lots of people asking me, dude, why would you do this, right? Why would you leave beautiful Seattle? Why would you walk away from a secure job? Why would you leave a great church to move back to your hometown where you haven't lived in 15 years? There's already a lot of churches here. And the only answer I really had to give in that season is, I feel compelled. There's just something burning inside of me. And I'd become so restless that I just got to the point in my life where I knew I needed to do one of two things with my life. Either A, I was going to launch a new church in Southeast Wisconsin, or B, I was going to become a bodybuilder. And since I did not want to waste my life, I decided to do both. Now listen, when we started, it was scary. I've talked about that so many times. We had no money. We had very, very few people. I had zero experience in leading a church. And in many ways, I felt like the captain of a merchant ship during a time where pirates were more prevalent than they are today. Right? Whenever a pirate ship would appear on the horizon, the captain of the ship would say to his crew, men, bring me my red shirt. And sure enough, the first mate would run off and grab his red shirt and bring it back to him, and the captain would put it on, and he would always lead his team in attacking the pirates and sinking the ship. Well, one day a sailor asked the captain, he says, why do you always ask for a red shirt to be brought to you in times of battle? And the captain responded, because if I'm wounded, you will not see blood. It will blend in, and you'll continue to fight as if nothing is wrong. Well, the entire crew ended up learning about his answer, and they were just astonished at the bravery of their captain. A couple weeks later, the captain of the ship looks up and he sees 20 pirate ships appear on the horizon. And the men looked to their captain, waiting for that familiar request that had brought them so much strength in the different battles. And as the captain is staring out at these 20 pirate ships, he says, men, bring me my brown pants. I feel like I have been calling for my brown pants ever since we started this church. It has not been an easy journey. There has been lots of uncertainty, but we've taken risks, we've prayed, and we've stepped out in faith. And I just want to tell you today that if Great Lakes Church is going to continue to thrive, if Great Lakes Church is going to continue to do more than just exist, it is going to have to take a risk over and over and over again. Now, when a church is in its first few years, it's actually easy to take risks because there isn't much to lose. The only hope of survival is take risks. Let's go for it. And so when it comes to the future of Great Lakes Church, don't forget to remember that the local church moves forward by playing offense, not defense. It's one of the biggest lessons I've learned over the last 15 years. We can't play defense. During COVID, it was easy to want to play defense and just kind of react and try to protect what we have. And there have been many times in the history of our church where it's just, the temptation is just to jump in and protect and preserve what we have. But a church that moves forward is a church that plays offense and not defense. Now, before I say anything else, I want to acknowledge that when I use the word church, I know there's different types of emotions that people have based on experiences, right? For some, those are good emotions. Others, they're just honestly horrific emotions. I recognize that. I don't want to minimize that. But I do want to say this, that regardless of how you personally feel about the church and regardless of your personal experiences with the church, it's important to know that Jesus loves the church. And Jesus cares for the church. And he's passionate about the church. And he's committed to the church. And he has the future in mind for the church. And so as messy and as dysfunctional as the church is at times, Jesus still loves the church. And this is important to know because it's increasingly popular for people to talk about the flaws they've seen in the church and to talk about their hurts and frustrations with the church. And I know those hurts are real. Again, I don't want to minimize that. But it is important for us to remind ourselves that Jesus loves the church and is committed to the church. 2,000 years ago, Jesus is standing in front of his disciples and he makes a statement about the church that has prevailed in every generation and in every culture throughout history. He said, I will build my church and all the powers of hell will not conquer it. That's an incredibly bold statement. And it's a very sobering statement when you think about it, because you look back throughout history in every generation, in every culture, and you realize Jesus has kept his promise. He has never, ever, ever stopped building his church. I mean, just think about that, right? Nothing in history has ever been able to stop the church. Persecution hasn't stopped it. Theological controversy hasn't stopped it. Scandals haven't stopped it. Poor leadership hasn't stopped it. Hypocrisy has not stopped it. Pandemics haven't stopped it. Intense opposition and even war hasn't stopped it. In every generation and in every culture for the past 2,000 years, the Church of Jesus Christ has continued to move forward. And when you stop and you think about it, at some point you have to wonder, how is that even possible? It's possible because of what I said a few moments ago. The local church moves forward by playing offense, not defense. Yes, little individual churches start up and eventually they close their doors. But it happens when they start playing defense, not offense. But the church at large, the Church of Jesus Christ, has never stopped moving forward. The church moves forward by taking risks, by going after those who aren't yet part of it. And this is core to who we've been from day one. I say that because 1 week before the official launch of our church, right? It's February 2009. Our practice services were in the fall of 2008, but now it's February 2009, 1 week before our launch. I'm standing in front of a few hundred people at the Brat Stop in Kenosha. And I give a talk on the kind of church that we're going to be. And I went back this week and I found that talk, and I just want to echo a few of the things I said. Right at the top of my notes, I wrote these words: we're going to be a church that takes risk. That was the whole heart of the talk. I said the older we get, the more difficult it's going to be to take risks. I said we haven't even started. But someday we're going to have things. We're going to have resources, we're going to have people, and there's going to be more to lose. I said the older we get as a church, the easier it will be to gravitate towards comfort. And here we are 15 years later, and I can assure you it's true. We have way more to lose today than we did in February of 2009. And I acknowledge there's going to be a day it's going to be difficult to take risks, but then I acknowledge I don't want to spend my life plagued by regrets. So I want to surround myself with people who take risks. I want to chase things in my heart. And then I spent some time talking about a guy named Benaiah. And I'm going to read what I wrote right from my notes. I'm not making this up. I wrote, Benaiah was a man's man. When I read this guy's resume, I'm convinced he's got like 3 balls. He bleeds testosterone. I only read that to let you know I have matured way, way, way much. And I would never say something so ridiculous today. But I said this about Benaiah, and then I read this verse. I said, Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was a valiant warrior from Kabzeel. He did many heroic deeds, which included killing 2 champions of Moab. Another time on a snowy day, he chased a lion down into a pit and he killed it. And after reading that verse, I talked about how Benaiah should have run from the lion, but instead he chased it. And I just want to tell you today how proud I am of this church for chasing lions with me over the past 15 years. Every time we've been confronted with a lion, a challenge, something intimidating, something overwhelming, something scary, you have stepped up and you've chased that lion with me. When we didn't own a building, you set up and you tore down week after week after week in 17 different settings. In a couple of weeks at Parkside, we will be in our 18th different setting. Even though we've had seasons where we lacked resources and we were scraping to get by, you've always stepped up and given generously to fuel mission work here, near, and far. Some of you may not know this, but before we ever purchased or leased a building for Great Lakes Church, we purchased property and paid for a facility to be built in India. Now, granted, it's not going to cost what it does here in the States, but that was the heart of who this church is. And for 15 years, instead of chasing comfort and chasing convenience, we've been chasing lions. And you showed up for 15 years when it's been difficult and when the motivation hasn't been there and the adrenaline rush is gone, and you've served our children and you've served our teenagers and you've opened your homes for groups and you've stood at doors and you've greeted people and you've come in the middle of the week and you've cleaned buildings and you've created an environment that welcomes people. You've been funding and volunteer in all sorts of initiatives and dreams. And I could spend hours talking about the lions we've chased and those things that we pursued because of a dream in our hearts. And by God's grace, that dream of starting a church for the rest of us has come to fruition. It happened. Great Lakes Church exists and it's making a difference here, near, and far. But now it's time to dream again. Because the church moves forward by playing offense, not defense. So I'll just wrap up by quickly giving you 3 traits of churches that play offense. Number 1, clarity. They know who they are and what they're trying to accomplish. We've always said, hey, we exist for the 70% of people in our area who do not go to church. That's who we focus on. That hasn't changed a bit. But as our church has gotten older, we've gained clarity on our uniqueness as a church. And so outside of weekly services and groups, we've said we really do 5 things. We care for the poor, we advocate for the overlooked, we equip healthy marriages, we prepare the next generation, and we start new churches. We do everything we can to saturate our homes, neighborhoods, and communities with the good news of Jesus, and this is how we do it. A church that plays offense is always working at trying to clarify who they are and what they're trying to accomplish. That's the first trait. Second trait of churches that play offense is courage. There's this desire to take risk and try new things. So we had this dream of starting a prom for kids with special needs. We did it. We went for it. We had this dream of starting a camp for kids in foster care. We went for it. When we were meeting in Tinseltown in year 1, our services were filling up, and we were like, man, we don't want to stop inviting people, but we don't have any space left. And so one of the scariest things we did was go from 1 auditoriums to 2 auditoriums just because of the complexity it brought. Here's a 1-minute video telling that story.
So as the church continued to grow, we knew that we wanted to send out another mailer to the community, this time a little bit more tame than our first one. And yet at the same time, we didn't have room to put anybody because we had 2 services. We were filling up our auditorium at both services. And so we started just brainstorming, calling around. And I don't remember who it was that kind of threw out the idea, probably a collection of all of us together. But we had this idea, let's add another auditorium and let's do it on video. So while I'm speaking live in one service, they'll watch it on video in another auditorium.
We outgrew one theater at Tinseltown, and so the natural progression is to have a second theater. And being in a theater, you can obviously reproduce video easily. It's ideal for that. And I remember it being kind of hectic the first week that we did it. I remember Justin Matthews running around and committing. I thought he was crazy. He was committed. Dave, he's like, we will have this working. We will have this going. And we did.
They did. They went from 1 auditorium to 2, and eventually we ended up at 5 adult auditoriums. This has been a church that has been willing to risk and try new things. 2012, as we were growing, we launched a Racine campus. A church that plays offense is always at work trying to clarify who they are and what they're trying to accomplish. And then they take risks as they courageously walk into their fears and attempt new things in pursuit of this dream. A third trait of churches that play offense is change, a willingness to pivot. And we have pivoted many, many times in our history. Right? When we sent out a mailer early on and were kicked out of Kenosha Unified School District, we pivoted. We met at the Broad Stop, then we met at Tinseltown, we figured it out. During the polar vortex, when a pipe froze at our Kenosha campus, we pivoted. First time in our history, we canceled the service, but we pivoted. 2020, when the world shut down because of COVID, we pivoted. We put much more focus on our online campus. In 2021, when the Racine campus roof collapsed, we pivoted again. As you know, at the end of September, I'm gonna be stepping down from my role as lead pastor of Great Lakes Church, and we're gonna be pivoting again. And the leadership teams will continue asking the same questions we've asked for the last 15 years. Who are we? What are we most passionate about? Who are we uniquely as a church designed to reach and impact? What's the best way to do what God's called us to do? And Pastor Josh is going to be leading the church this time of transition, and I want you to hear this. I have full confidence in him. Quite honestly, I wish he would have joined our staff years ago. Josh and I were talking this past week, and I said, hey, I promise you could say anything, right? What do you think you're going to change? Like part of the mission, kind of vision, like what are you going to change? He goes, Dave, I can tell you this. I love what we do. I love a church that cares for the poor and advocates for the overlooked and equips healthy marriages and prepares the next generation and starts new churches. And I don't want to change any of it. I'm telling you, I believe to the core of my being, the best is yet to come. If I did not believe that, I don't think my season at Great Lakes Church would have come to an end. But I do. I've felt this restlessness for a while, and I feel like it's time to hand the baton to another leader and to hand it to you and to say, run with this. Now, we went several minutes over today than we normally do, and if that bothers you and you're sitting there thinking, well, if I was in charge, then it sounds like God is calling you to start a church. Let me pray for you. Heavenly Father, we thank you for what you've done in and through Great Lakes Church over the last 15 years. I pray that the Holy Spirit would equip and empower and renew us in such a unique way that we'll be ready to go for the next 15 years. Help Great Lakes Church to be a church that plays offense, not defense. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thanks for joining us here at Great Lakes Church. Again, my name is Carson, and I'm so glad that you chose to share some time with us this week. We hope something in this talk was meaningful to you, encouraging to you, and maybe even something worth writing down that you can go share with a friend. If you'd like to get involved, maybe join us at one of our physical locations in Southeast Wisconsin, or just be a part of our many other goings-on our social platforms or events in the area. Check out greatlakeschurch.com.